Hi, I'm Gary Hamill, and I'm here with my colleague, Michele Zanini, and welcome to the New Human Movement. Today, again, a really smart, really special guest, Professor Tom Malone. He's the Patrick McGovern Professor of Management at MIT's Sloan School. He also is head of MIT's Center for Collective Intelligence, and we're going to dig into that shortly. I feel that in some ways, Tom and I have been on parallel paths. Tom wrote an early and very influential piece on internal markets. I had my own take on that. In 2004, Tom wrote The Future of Work, foreseeing much of what we've been talking about in this series, and also much of what I talked about in The Future of Management. Tom's most recent book, Superminds, appeared in 2018. And, Tom is one of those rare people who basically everything he says is new and it's important. I've had the chance to read, and Tom's been involved in various things we've worked on through the years together. I guess, Tom, one article we kind of, I drew on your thinking, Moonshots for Managers in Harvard Business Review. I would recommend our readers to that. But Tom, thanks so much for agreeing to chat with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Gary, and great to see you again.
So let's kind of, dig in. Superminds is an immensely thoughtful book. And as I understand it, your argument is that technology is allowing us to aggregate human wisdom, human capability in new ways. And maybe we're not really exploiting that, very well yet. But talk to us about the promise of this and how are these new collaborative technologies going to allow us to do together what we struggle to do alone. So maybe just start with a fundamental thesis, and then we're going to drill down what this means for the future of work, the future of organizations. But why don't you start with kind of your core take on all this, Tom?
Great. So I think the two key messages in the book Superminds. The first is that I think we're spending way too much time thinking about people or computers, and not nearly enough time thinking about people and computers. Too much time, for instance, thinking about how many jobs computers are going to take away from people, and not enough time thinking about what people and computers can do together that could never be done before. So that's the first message of the book. In a sense, that's kind of the straightforward message. But there's a deeper message of the book that, in a sense, is about a new way of looking at the world. In a sense, this second message is about how to see ghosts. Now, I don't mean real ghosts, if such things even exist, but I do mean powerful entities that are all around us all the time. These ghosts are superminds, which I define as groups of individuals acting together in ways that seem intelligent. Now, by that very broad definition, superminds really are all around us all the time. And in fact, almost everything we humans have ever accomplished wasn't done by individual humans working alone. These things were done by groups of people working together, often over time and space, in various kinds of superminds. Now, these superminds include hierarchies, democracies, markets, communities, and what I call ecosystems. And so I think that vocabulary is a way of starting to think more systematically and more creatively about how people and computers and groups of people, even if there aren't computers involved, how all these kinds of superminds can do new things that we could never do before. So that's, in a few words, kind of a summary of the whole book.
And so if I understand you, Tom, what you're arguing with is over the centuries as human beings, we have found ways of aggregating human effort and intelligence, as I said, so we can do together what we can't do alone. I mean, clearly, bureaucracy was a way of doing that. If you look at Henry Ford bringing together thousands of people to create this immensely complex thing called an automobile, right? I mean, what we can do as a species is largely limited by our capacity to come together and do things in new ways. And your thesis is that technology is going to really immensely amplify that. And I guess, so far in our lives, we see email, that kind of connects us together. Now we see things like Slack and kind of projectware, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, and so on. But I think you have some examples, or at least you have a vision of this that is more profound than simply, bringing us together in conversation or allowing us to share calendars and documents. Maybe give us a sense of what's your aspiration, or what's kind of a bleeding edge example of bringing people together using technology to do some fairly complex or amazing things.
Well, let me start with something that's not exactly bleeding edge. Everybody knows about it. Most people use it almost every day, and that's Google. Think of Google, just the search part of Google, not the other things they do now too. But if you think of Google, it's a whole system. It's not just Google, the company. It's millions of people all over the world creating all kinds of knowledge and making it available on the web. And then the Google search algorithms kind of integrate and search that knowledge so that when you ask a question of Google, the answers you get often seem amazingly intelligent, or at least a certain sense of intelligence. So that's just one example, I think, of how people and computers together can do something that would never even remotely have been possible if you were having humans doing all that searching all the time. And in fact, even the algorithms would be of no use unless there were also millions of humans out there generating the content to be searched. So we could do lots of examples, but that's one to start with.
Let me share something, which is, I came across a really interesting example that kind of surprised me, Tom. I'm going to see if I can put it up here on the screen and we'll find out, because I'd love to get your comment on this. This was something that was done a few years ago, I think in 2017, by Reddit. And they ran this little collaborative experiment, which I thought was very cool. I think it took place just over 72 hours. But they put up a screen that I think was I want to say it was 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, right, or something like that. I'll forget. But basically it was like this, but only amplified. And any user could come in and you could click on one pixel and change the color they had 16 different colors. But once you change that, you couldn't change it again for a matter of minutes. So I couldn't just come in and construct an image. I could come in, change a pixel one color, and then I was locked out for a bit. Well, they ran this over 72 hours, and what happened was communities of people on Reddit started to get together and coordinate these little individual pixel clicks. It was called Our Place, by the way, if you want to go look that up on Reddit. But what they ended up with was this, right? So a team says, well, let's do the Mona Lisa, let's do the American flag, let's do the Rolling Stones logo, whatever it is. But I think if you'd said, hey, we're just going to let people come in one at a time, change the color of one pixel, you would have had a hard time imagining people would spontaneously figure out how to collaborate, to do something like that. So is that the kind of thing you have in mind?
Sure, that's a great example. In a sense, that's kind of a toy, but I think there are all kinds of much more serious work that can be done in dramatically new ways when we can coordinate people in the ways these technologies make possible.
And an example or two would be what?
So one example would be hyper-specialization. That's an example of a concept, but let me give you a couple of examples of it. Imagine that, well, we've already seen examples of that in things like medicine, where doctors, for instance, specialize in very small parts of medicine. We've seen it in physical work in factories for hundreds of years. But I think as technology makes it cheaper and cheaper to communicate all over the world, and faster to do that as well, we're going to see lots more hyper-specialization in knowledge work, not just physical work. So think of the task of making slides, for instance. Today, lots of relatively highly paid and intelligent professionals spend a lot of their time fiddling with bits on their slides to make them look good. Imagine there were a service where different people who specialized in different parts of slide preparation could do a lot of that work for you. You might kind of do a rough draft of some ideas, and some people would clean up the grammar, and somebody else would clean up the colors and the logos and all that stuff. And each of the people who do that would be really highly specialized in doing the exact thing they did, so they could do it faster and cheaper than anyone else. And I think it's easy to imagine something like that being much better than the way we do it today. It's also easy to imagine computers doing some of those things too. Not all of the hyper-specialized work would be done by people. Some could be done by computers. Another example of that might be in the legal field. Right now, a lot of time of legal associates is spent doing research to find things that other lawyers, other judges, etc., have said all over the country say. But imagine you had people who were highly specialized in very specific kinds of legal questions. Imagine, for instance, there was someone who spent their whole life, mostly, thinking about what are the rules of evidence in murder trials in the state of Texas, or whatever the specialized example is. So you can imagine that people who do that would be able to answer almost all the questions you'd ever thought of almost instantly. They don't have to do any research like the junior associate would have to do. They just know the answer or can find it very, very quickly. So even though they could charge much more per hour than the associate who's scanning all these things to find the answer the first time, it might still be much cheaper to you, the lawyer who needed the answer, than paying somebody else to do it in the traditional way.
So technology, you're saying, Tom, if I understand, is it allows me to specialize exactly where I can add the most value. It can connect me to a global market of individuals for whom my expertise will add value. And it also allows you to aggregate the various bits and pieces of that expertise that you may need, for example, to build your case as a lawyer. Is that kind of what you have in mind here?
Exactly. That's one way this can be done. Um, Another way you can think of this happening is not just hyper specialization, but much richer coordination. Think about the process of designing an automobile. Traditionally, when we coordinate that in a kind of hierarchical way, a bureaucratic way, different silos of the company design different parts of the car. Somebody's designing the tire, somebody else the engine or the seat or whatever. And there's managers at higher and higher levels that say, oh, well, this looks okay. This doesn't quite work because somebody else over in some other silo is doing something that's not compatible with that, but you might not find that for days or weeks or months until it gets to the right level in the hierarchy where the conflict is discovered. Imagine instead you could have all kinds of direct connections between the engineer who was working on designing the seat and the engineer who was working on designing the cushion for the seat or whatever it is. So they could be continually modifying their plans. Each sees what the other is doing, talking directly to each other as needed. That's the kind of thing that happens sometimes today, but often kind of by chance if you're in a real bureaucracy. You can imagine much richer kinds of connections like that the technology will make not only possible, but cheap and easy to do.
Because what you're really describing, and I think we see the early kind of shadow of this, Tom. And I want to come back and get you to kind of tell us, how far how much progress organizations have made on this. But what it seems to be happening is we're moving from organizations that were primarily vertical, which is an artifact of a time when information communication was very expensive. So you'd have 10 people report up to a boss who would aggregate their information, and that manager tried to solve the coordination problem. But you're describing organizations becoming much more lateral, where a lot of that coordination collaboration is happening laterally across the community, rather than we're relying on managers to manage the linkages and so on. And clearly, we do have tools now like Slack that help us do that. But if you think this is an inevitable evolution towards flatter, more lateral organizations, how far along are we in that process, do you think? And if you look at the existing technologies, are we going to need a lot better tools, or do we have pretty good tools already?
Great question. In fact, in the first part of your question there, you kind of summarized one of the main arguments I made in my book on the future of work. which is that the reason we have so many hierarchical ways of coordinating things today is because hierarchies turn out to be a really good way of coordinating things when communication is possible but still pretty expensive. Before the communication was even possible, like when we had hunting and gathering bands, you couldn't even communicate with somebody on the other side of the country or even the other side of the mountain. You could only talk to the other people who were right there next to you in your little band or tribe. When it becomes possible to do that longer distance communication, then it becomes possible to coordinate things over much larger groups of people, but still fairly expensive. If you have to communicate by sending letters on horseback or by carrying them or even by using expensive telegrams, you still can't afford to do much of that communication. And so the best way of coordinating large groups when you've got present but expensive communication is to bring a lot of the information to a single point where the decisions get made and orders sent out to the people who need to carry them out. And I think it's therefore no accident, and it's actually very smart that many of our organizations, the ones we've all kind of been raised in for the most part, use this hierarchical form because it's a smart way of doing things when you've got expensive communication. Communication gets cheaper, though. It becomes economically feasible for essentially everyone to talk to everyone. It becomes possible to not just coordinate at the top, but coordinate laterally all over the place. And that's, I think, something that has happened to a dramatic degree in the last few decades.
I mean, I just have to ask one follow-up there, though, Tom, one clarifying thing. Because the role of that leader was not only to aggregate that information, but was then to make sense of it and act. And one of the questions I think maybe a lot of people have had is, as we see organizations becoming more lateral and you have kind of many-to-many communications, like, how does order come out of that? How does consistency come out of that? And you know, when you have everything connected to everything, how do you get to the point where there's some alignment and there's a decision and you get to some consensus and the organization is moving forward in a coordinated way rather than just having, you know, I mean, at the extreme you have, you have like social media and it's just, it's just a kind of chaotic set of conversations, very densely connected, but it doesn't really lead anywhere. So do you have a thought on?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, I left out this part as I was summarizing it a minute ago, but you're absolutely right that the people who have access to all this information in a lateral way still have to make decisions. So each person in their own part of the organization has to make their own decisions somehow instead of just following orders from someone above them in the hierarchy. But if they have access to all the information needed to make a sensible decision, then they can do that themselves instead of waiting for the boss to tell them what to do. So in order for that to happen, you actually need two things. The first is these people have to have the information. The second is they have to have the incentives that will lead them to use that information to make decisions that don't just benefit them personally, but that benefit the organization as a whole. So one of the key aspects of designing these decentralized organizations, it's true in any organization, but especially important in these decentralized ones, is to design not only the communication structure, but also the incentive structure. So if I'm incented perhaps by just contributing as much as I can to corporate profit, if I do a task for which the profitability can be measured, then that may be a lot of what you need to do to incentivize me properly. Tell me, I want you to maximize profit, and you can use all this information to help you figure out how to do that. Go to it. And if everybody does that, then you kind of maximize profit for the company as a whole. You need some rules about things you can't do, probably. And you may well need ways of helping all these more decentralized decision makers come up with coherent plans. But there are a lot of ways to do that. In fact, one way that I know you know about, but a lot of people don't often think of it this way, is with markets. as opposed to hierarchies. So when you have a market, whether it's an internal market within a company or an external market between companies, that gives you a lot of the structure you need to get coherent action. So if you and I, Gary, both have an idea about how to do something, but they're different ideas, we could try, each of us, to do our own idea. But if you can convince McKaylee and hundreds of other people that your idea is better, and I can't convince anyone that my idea is better, better enough to buy from me or from you, then your idea wins without some boss telling us. It was kind of like the market demand that makes the decisions.
So markets are a particular version, the sort of market we see, like as maybe a Kickstarter. That's a certain type of a supermind, then, right? You have all this intelligence coming together to make judgments about what looks like it's a great product or likely to find a market and what's not.
Exactly, right. So market is one type of supermind, and that's one reason why I think this supermind concept is useful, because it gives you this set of 5 types of superminds that you can think about how each of those might be useful in a particular situation.
And the 5 are, Tom, I don't think we just went through that little taxonomy.
Yeah, I think I said it really quickly, but I'll say it again with a little more detail. If I didn't say it in this conversation, it was in the one before, but I think it was in this one. So the first type and the most obvious type of supermind is hierarchies. So where group decisions are made by delegating them to a specific individual in the group. The second type of supermind is democracies, where group decisions are made by voting. The third kind of supermind is markets, where the group decisions are essentially the combination of all the individual pairwise agreements between buyers and sellers. The fourth kind of supermind is communities, where the group decisions are made by a kind of informal consensus based on shared norms and reputations. Now, all 4 of those kinds of superminds require at least some amount of cooperation. For instance, in a market, you may be competing with other companies, say, but you have to at least cooperate to the extent you're using the same kind of currency and following laws and things like that. So they all require some kind of cooperation. But when you don't have any cooperation, you have what the 5th kind of supermind, which I call ecosystems, where the group decisions are made by the law of the jungle. Whoever has the most power gets what they want, and the survival of the fittest. So those types of superminds, I wouldn't claim that's a complete taxonomy of all kinds of groups in the world, but I think it's at least a very comprehensive taxonomy that encompasses most of the things we see in the world around us.
I hope you're enjoying the conversation, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank Hire for underwriting the costs of producing this interview. Hire is the world's leading appliance company and also a global leader in the Internet of Things. For the last decade, Hire has been leading a remarkable revolution in management. It is proven that even the largest, most complex organizations in the world can be entrepreneurial at their core. Now, back to our conversation.
One question I wanted to probe on is hierarchy as a supermind, right? In most organizations, since we operate as bureaucracy, kind of over-index on that, right? And probably the area where that is most obvious is around setting strategy and direction, right? Because we just assume that it's the responsibility of people at the top, maybe with the help of some consultants, to make sense of the world, and then say, here's how we're gonna, tackle opportunities and challenges, right, that we face. And I think you talk about that in your book and in an article that you wrote for the MIT Sloan Management Review, that this kind of approach, this kind of insular top-down approach, just leaves a lot of value on the table, and that's why you end up with strategies that aren't very differentiated from competitors, and with a lot of employees who are just not really understanding what the strategy is because they haven't been involved, and they're just communicated this high-level vision that doesn't really make a lot of sense to them. So and I think you offer a very practical kind of thought experiment for how a large company might use some of these other superminds and technology to completely reinvent the strategy process and make it much more open and bold and powerful. So could you help us kind of talk about, if you were hired by Procter and Gamble and IBM and so on to help them think about reinventing the strategy process to harness the collective intelligence of everyone working in those companies, what would you tell them?
Yeah, so great. You're referring to the example I used in Superminds and in the Sloan Management Review article. I said it in the context of Procter and Gamble, not because Procter and Gamble is actually doing this, but because it's something they could do, and because they've talked a lot about how they did strategy before. To think about this, let me introduce one other set of key concepts from the Superminds book, which is not just the types of superminds, as we talked about a minute ago, but the cognitive processes that any supermind must carry out. In other words, any intelligent entity, whether it's a person or a group or a computer, has to do 5 kinds of things. They have to decide what actions to take. They generally have to create options for what those actions could be. They can usually do those 2 things better if they can sense the world around them and if they can remember the past. And if they're really smart, they can learn to do all of those things better and better over time by learning from their own experience. So we've got decide, create, sense, remember, and learn are the 5 different cognitive processes. So let's use that framework for thinking about how a company like Procter & Gamble could do strategic planning, and in particular, how they could do it in a much more open way, involving many more people than just the few senior executives and maybe some consultants and so forth. So let's start with how they could create options for their strategic plan. Imagine, instead of just depending on the people in the room around the board table to come up with ideas, you could let anyone in the company come up with an idea. You could say, if you're in this business unit and you're interested in a particular product, what's an idea about how that product could be done differently, how we could price it differently, or how we would market it differently, or whatever. And maybe what's an idea for a new product we might sell. So anybody could be coming up with ideas like this. And you could have competitions within a given business unit, say, or actually within a given product, let's say, for which of those ideas or which combinations of those ideas were most promising. You could have the existing executives judge those competitions if you wanted, but it might be interesting to have some kind of voting or other kind of decision-making process for that. You can also imagine this happening at multiple levels. For instance, you could imagine one set of competitions for each product or potential product. What's the best strategic plan or set of strategic plans for that product? Then you could imagine another level where you've got a different set of people competing to put together strategic plans for each of the different sets, each different set of products into a coherent plan for a whole business unit. And then at the level above that, you can have people competing to put together plans for the different business units into a plan for the company as a whole. So that's what we call a contest web. It's a web of contests at each level, competing to see who can put together the things from the level below in the most interesting way. So that, I think, is already An interesting way you could let lots more people be involved in creating ideas, and then we need to decide which of those ideas are most promising. We already talked about how you could do that hierarchically or you could do that democratically. Another interesting possibility is to use markets to make those decisions. For instance, I think we talked a little bit already about prediction markets and how you can have people buying and selling predictions of different possible outcomes. You could imagine something like that being used to help evaluate these different strategic plans. People could be buying and selling predictions of, if we use this product in this way, what's the likely sales and profit for this unit in this product in different years. You could have all kinds of people participating in these prediction markets. So that's a way of bringing lots of people from throughout the company, or perhaps from other companies even, to help predict what would happen if you did different strategic plans. So that's the decide as well as the create part. How about sensing? In order to come up with good plans, in order to evaluate how promising they are, you certainly need to sense the world that would affect those things. And there are lots of ways, as we know now, of using big data as a way of doing that. Amazon, for instance, uses vast amounts of data from their customers and their suppliers and so forth to figure out all kinds of things, like if you sell this combination of features for a particular lawnmower at this price, this is the response you get. But if you lower the price, it does this. And if you add this feature, it does that. So all kinds of things you can imagine sensing by computers primarily, but of course humans are asking the questions and analyzing the results to help make the plans better. You also can imagine systems helping people remember things better. So, for instance, if you're coming up with strategic plans, you all know as well as anyone that there are some kind of generic strategies that are often good ideas to consider. Some companies, for instance, compete on the basis of low cost. Others might compete on the basis of high quality. So you can imagine a system that would help suggest to humans different generic strategies they could consider if they haven't already considered them. And then so that's more the remembering. And then the final thing is the learning. How could you learn to build better strategic plans this way? There, I think a really interesting possibility is what I call a cyber-human learning loop. So you could imagine, for instance, suppose you're trying to evaluate different parts of these strategic plans. You could imagine having humans look at the different plans and saying, yeah, this is a good idea, that's a bad idea, these two are good ideas, etc. And you can imagine at the same time the humans are doing that, you've got computers watching the input they received, the decision they made. And the computers, using machine learning, could be trying to determine the patterns that the people were using to make those decisions. They wouldn't be able to understand all of those patterns in general, but at least some of them, and more over time, the computers might get pretty good at predicting what a human's going to do if they see one of these things. And so the computer could start suggesting to the humans, I think this is a case where you're going to say X. If you agree, you just click it and you don't even have to think about it much more. If not, you change it and say whatever is right. But over time, the computer would get better and better at guessing more and more of what the human would have done. And eventually, it might not even have to ask the human. It could just do it automatically if the human always agrees with what the computer does in those cases. So that's an example of how you could use combinations of people and computers to do all these different kind of cognitive processes involved in strategic planning. And I think if you think about it, what we've just described is kind of like a human-computer strategy machine. It kind of keeps generating strategies, and you could imagine that it could do this so quickly and so effectively that it wouldn't do just one strategic plan a year. It could do several strategic plans every day if it needed to. So whenever any kind of little thing changes in the environment, some new parts of the plan could be readjusted almost immediately. And you could imagine that a company that could do this kind of planning could run circles around its competitors.
You know, Tom, I got to riff on that for a moment, because I think what you're saying sounds so radical that like people's heads may explode a little bit. So let me just share a little bit of anecdote and personal experience there to underline like this is possible and is kind of becoming an imperative as you suggest there at the end. You know, and let me just back up a step, because, you know, we're talking about superminds, and I think, and as Michele kind of said too, when it comes to strategy, we think the supermind is the CEO, right? And if you say who's accountable for strategy or who's responsible, it's like that person. And you're talking about Procter and Gamble. I don't want to really pick on them, because they're a very smart company and a very capable company. But let me share just this little thing. You know, A.G. Lafley, I think, was twice CEO chairman of Procter & Gamble, a very smart guy, met him, a super nice guy, but he kind of expressed this thinking, you know, when he said this was in an interview, he said, the CEO can see opportunities that others don't see and make the judgments and tough calls others are unable to make. And you're like, maybe that's true, but this idea that, you know, that there's some small group of people at the top who have the experience, the cognitive capacity, the vision, the creativity to kind of plot the future for an organization. You're being very diplomatic, but like that just like I don't think that works anymore. And here's my little bit of shared my own experience. My first kind of attempt with kind of open strategy, collaborative strategy was in 1993 with Nokia. And they had asked me to come help them think about how do they beat Motorola. So we ended up involving a couple of thousand people at Nokia in the strategy process. We trained them how to think about industry dogma and how to get at unarticulated customer needs. And then we sent them out to generate, you know, a whole bunch of new strategic options. And out of that came a very interesting game-changing strategy that generated a lot of wealth. But unfortunately, like 10 years later, everybody was so happy and successful, nobody wanted to bother to go back and like ask the organization again, you know, where should we go next? So they ended up, you know, getting supplanted by Apple. But the things I took away from that really, really briefly were this. I mean, first of all, if you really want to create a groundbreaking strategy, you got to create a lot of options, right? You need the quality of any strategy depends on how many alternatives you generated in the first place. And if it's a small group of people, you just don't have very rich pickings. I think the second thing that hit me was that you know, as you're generating these ideas, you really can't expect people at the top who have all their emotional equity invested in the business model. They are not the best place to evaluate these options. As you were saying, you know, it's more like a market, and you want a lot of people saying, well, that seems exciting or that seems kind of dumb. But when you have kind of just a small number of people who are kind of judge and jury on new ideas, that's not going to go in a good place. The third thing that struck me was that often this collective intelligence you're talking about, what's really amazing about that is not kind of individual ideas, but it's the patterns. And you start to see it in that case at Nokia, you start to see like a whole bunch of people say, this thing can be more than just a phone. You know, it can be used for payments, it can be a camera, it can be used for texting and so on. And it's the strength of those patterns when you go like, wow, we have a lot of people who are seeing this. And the last thing that I took away from that is when you make that a broadly participative process where everybody sees like how we got to that strategic answer, there's great enthusiasm for it at the end. There's a lot of confidence in it. And so you're radically shrinking this, you know, this time from formulation to implementation. So I don't know if those things, you know, you found in your own experience, but I just want to say what you just said, what you just laid out, like that is, I think, the future of strategy. And I think it is a potentially huge source of competitive advantages to mine that collective intelligence, to look for the patterns, and you know, and doing it like top down. We just see again and again those strategies are too orthodox. You know, they you know, they're too bound by old thinking. So it's I think you're pointing us, I believe, 100% in the right direction.
Well, that's nice to hear. I guess I do think it's the future of strategy too, and I think that most companies, in order to do this well, will have to use a bunch of infrastructure. I don't think this will be something that most companies can afford to build for themselves. I think there'll be a bunch of strategic planning infrastructure that makes all this possible across companies. I think that it's also an example of how things can be done really differently. I liked your picture of A.G. Lafley, who actually said a lot of things I quoted in setting up the P&G context in my book. I think he's right that sometimes the senior people can see things that others can't. But what he leaves out, and what I think is extremely important, is that the opposite is true too. Sometimes people at the bottom of the organization or in all different parts of the organization can see things the senior executives can't see.
That leads to a segue here, and then let's spend some time on this. Because you're saying, okay, we may need this new kind of technology infrastructure to do this. That may be the case. I mean, I'm thinking we've done these open strategy things like before the internet, and I think technology now does make it possible. You can put up a MOOC, you can put up an idea market. There are a lot of tools, if you're serious about this, I think, that could help you do it. But here's what I would ask. This idea of open strategy, you're just talking about it, and there's other folks like Hank Chesborough at Berkeley who have ideas in this realm. And I'll show you something. And this is a little slide that I put together in 1997. So that's quite a long time ago. This was after, and we'd done a couple of these open strategy projects. And it was clear that technology, by bringing people together, making all the thinking transparent, involving lots of people, allowing you to upload video and make the conversation kind of richer and more emotional, experiential, just shrinking the time. I mean, it was clear that a lot of the things that you've talked about here, that this was possible. So I guess my segue is this, Tom. Like, why aren't organizations embracing this? This is so logical. Many of the tools are already there. And and you've been writing about this for a while. Your internal markets piece is, when did you write that? A couple of decades ago, I guess. What is holding organizations back from embracing the power of collective intelligence in helping them design their future?
I think the short answer is outdated mindsets. I have a friend at the MIT Media Lab, a faculty member named Mitch Resnick, who's talked for many years about what he calls the centralized mindset. So most of us grew up in a world where hierarchies really were the best way of doing most things. And we just think of that naturally. If you want to solve a problem, you need to put someone in charge. If something went wrong, you need to figure out who to blame and who's going to fix it. Those things work well in many situations in the past, but not all situations, and I think fewer and fewer all the time, because the technology makes it possible to coordinate effectively in much more decentralized ways that weren't possible before. So I think the technology makes it possible to do things long before human norms and human habits and human mindsets and human imagination catch up with it. Take a simple example of the automobile, or in fact, think of the changes that occurred as the automobile became more widespread and cheaper and better. The first order change was that we substituted automobiles for other kinds of transportation like horses or walking. That's not too hard to imagine. Once you see it, you can kind of do it, but it still takes a while for you to sell your horse and get over your fear of these newfangled things that make noise and stuff. That's the first order change. A second order change, by the way, I'm giving you this from a Scientific American article I wrote in about 1991, I believe. The second order of change is when something gets cheaper and better, like transportation with automobiles, we do a lot more of it. So instead of going to town once a week, maybe, you can go to town every day and pick up milk if you forgot to buy it when you were there 2 days ago. So you just do more and more transportation when it gets cheaper. And then the third order effect with transportation is you develop new transportation intensive structures like suburbs and shopping malls. Those wouldn't have been possible without the cheap communication of cars, but we wouldn't have even thought to do them until we had gone through the first two stages. We had to kind of get used to it before our imagination and the economics would even make it possible to come up with and then implement those ideas. I think the same things are happening with communication and organization. As communication gets cheaper and cheaper, we go through these three orders of effects. More of it, first we substitute the old way for the new way, then we do more and more of the communication, and then we develop new communication and coordination intensive structures that wouldn't even have been imaginable, much less feasible, without that cheap communication ability.
So you're giving us a positive picture about the future, that this is kind of inevitable. You were just need to let the system play itself out. But we are some in a way a little impatient, right? Because we'd like to create organizations that are more capable to meet the needs of the 21st century. And so I'd love to get your thoughts on, like, how might we accelerate this adoption, and how might we deal with the issue of power, right? Because it seems to me that, and it's related to mindset, but it may be deeper in the sense that, one reason why people may not want to bid out a question about how whether we should do this merger or acquisition, or whether we should launch this product to a prediction market, is that if the executive wants to do that, does it, and it fails, and it confirms what the collective intelligence of the firm said, that person will look foolish and may lose their job, or they may not be able to justify their big compensation package if they're like bidding out the question of what the company should do to a large group of people, right? And what's their value added if they're not making the big decisions, and why should they deserve the $10 million pay package they have? And so how much of this is about that, and overcoming the way power is distributed in companies today?
Yeah, let me just add one thing to that. If you look at the growth of social media, these new collaborative technologies, it wasn't the gatekeepers of the old media who said, hey, let's create YouTube and let everybody post their content, or Twitter, right? I mean, that took kind of a revolution, and there were winners and losers. So just to building on Michele's point about power.
Yeah. So now you're bringing in the fifth kind of supermind, which I call ecosystems, where it's whoever has the most power gets what they want. That doesn't explain everything in the world, but it does explain a lot of important things, including the examples you're just bringing up. If you're in a big hierarchy and some people have a whole lot more power than others, and they don't want to lose the benefits they get from that power, they can often delay by quite a long time changes that might have made sense economically long ago. Sometimes, by the way, it's not even just that, it's just changing norms. I think we saw a great example of that just in the last year with COVID, and things that were possible in March of 2020, but no one remotely imagined that they were going to happen in May of 2020, about everybody working remotely. It was possible technically then, only very recently, by the way, but it took in that case a huge external shock from the environment to accelerate a change much faster than would ordinarily have happened if everybody had to kind of agree and change the norms along the way. So I think people with power, absent huge external shocks like that, really can delay these things, and to the degree that things can be done better if power is distributed much more widely. That gets delayed when people who have power don't want to give it up. But I think in the longer term, eventually other things like the economic desirability and the human desirability of doing things in a better way eventually wins. How can you accelerate that? There's probably a lot of specific answers. In general, you need to come up with the new ideas and try them out. That's basically entrepreneurial activity. Um, you could say that Elon Musk accelerated the adoption of electric cars, not by writing articles about how it was a good idea, but by actually proving that you could do it and making the other companies realize they had to compete or they'd be left behind. So that's one way of accelerating it. There's certainly also a lot to be said for changing mindsets and changing cultures. So there is value to be kind of had by writing about this and popularizing these ideas and all those things. So I don't think there's any single answer. I guess one thing I've said ever since I talked about the future of work is that the most important new innovations are probably in this domain are probably not going to come first in the big, powerful, successful old companies. They're probably going to come first in the new, scrappy, weird companies. And it's only when they turn out to work really well that the other more traditional companies will adopt those ideas. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally it does. And maybe we in our book we have a few examples of companies that use the power of markets, the allocational agility or the collective intelligence in piecemeal ways. We have an example of Intel using prediction markets to forecast sales of particular products, and we have an example of IBM. They have a long history of this with innovation jams, but more recently they did this initiative called Cognitive Build, which is about getting from thousands of employees ideas about the next billion-dollar business for the company. So, but you're right. I mean, a lot of these companies do it, and they may not stick with it. They may move on to the next thing, and it doesn't get systematized. The company that we know well that has probably the most evolved model, where you're leveraging markets and the external environment to a full extent, is Hire. Where literally the whole company is supposed to be sensing what's happening in the markets. That are divided into these small enterprises that contract with each other, that seek capital from outside as much as inside, and so on. But and hopefully, since the company is doing well and they become a large player in appliances, others will start to learn. But as you say, they will need to draw some pretty hard lessons about the executive team will about their role. And let me just maybe ask you one more question on that. Not to paint this like I don't want to be the person that only has bad news or paints a gloomy picture, but one could argue that advances in technology, whether it's AI or big data, may actually have a countervailing effect to what you're saying. That is, they may actually give more information to people at the top who, with their own judgment or maybe aided by algorithms, get to run or seek to run the company by kind of remote control on their iPad. And so, like, do you think that is a well-founded fear or not?
Well, I think cheap communication can allow both more centralized control for the reason you said, and more decentralized control for the reasons we were talking about earlier. So both are possible. In my book, The Future of Work, I talked about the sort of simple conditions needed for one to dominate over the other. And if you have some benefits of decentralized decision making that are important, like you get more creativity or more motivation or whatever, if those things are important, then they will dominate the ability of the centralized decision maker to control things. They can still try to do that, but it won't work as well if you get benefits from the decentralization. So that's why I think that while it won't happen everywhere, it's likely to happen in more and more parts of our economy.
Yeah, Tom, I want to go back to a couple things you've talked about. One, you said, you talked about the old mindsets and the centralizing mindset. And I just want to underline, I think that is like a huge part of what's been holding us back. And this will give us a segue to another question we have for you. But again, let me share a little example that goes way back in history. So back in the 17th century, when muskets and fusiliers came into military warfare, they basically just substituted what had been archers for musketeers. And so you still had all these pikemen in the middle with the long pikes to impale the enemy, and then on their flanks you have these musketeers. And you ask, like, well, why, now that we have the musket, why are we still using pikemen at all? And why do you have musketeers like 8 or 9 ranks deep? That doesn't seem to make sense. Archers fire over the heads of, but like musketeers, not so much. And the guys who looked at the history of this, it's a wonderful book on revolutions and military affairs, it's called. But they looked at this, and it literally takes more than 100 years for them to kind of change the way they organize, combat units to reflect this new technology. And the guys who did this research, what they were trying to answer is like, why did it take so long? And the conclusion they came to was, well, you had to wait for a couple of generations of generals to die off, right? And then finally, now we can use this. And what you said rings so true, your analogy about the automobile, because what it seems to us is if you look at the way collaborative technologies are being used now, and I kind of sometimes derisively call these like projectware, but it's the Slack and it's the Microsoft Teams and so on. It seems like we said, okay, we can use these new collaborative tools to make white collar work more efficient, like the 21st century version of Microsoft Office. So we can allow teams to share documents, set schedules, coordinate, and so on. But the real questions that you're raising is, well, how do we do this to change the way we make strategy? How do we do this to change the way we allocate resources? Or Michele's example about hire, right? How do we use markets for very dynamic inter-firm coordination that allows us to reconfigure rather than like doing that through a hierarchy? And it seems to me, that when you look back through history, our organizational innovation has often lagged the technology innovation by a long time. Is that your experience? And, maybe to circle back, like anything else that can be done to accelerate that?
I think it's always going to take some time for humans to adapt to the new possibilities their technology enables. We can accelerate that by things we've already talked about, entrepreneurial activity, cultural change, etc. But I think it's always going to take some time. And in some sense, perhaps we shouldn't be at all surprised that it's taking us decades to incorporate into our new organizational thinking the capabilities that technologies have made possible. What would be really amazing is that if it happened overnight or in a month or in a year. It's certainly going to take years and in many cases decades, I think, for the ramifications of these technologies and the possibilities of these technologies to really be realized in the ways we design our organizations.
All right, Tom, thanks for inspiring us. And it may take time, but I think you've also said there is a payoff to being in front on some of these things if you do it in the right way. So thanks for sharing that. Tom's book, The Future of Work, is still at the bleeding edge. You want to check that out. Superminds as well. Follow Tom online, what he's writing. Super helpful. Tom, thanks for being part of the conversation.
Thank you. Great conversation. Thanks a lot.